mocked him, humiliated him, and pushed him around, but they had no idea who they were messing with. The bus ride to Lincoln Heights, Missouri was long and quiet. As the vehicle rumbled along the highway, Dorian leaned against the window and watched the scenery slowly shift, from the congested, bustling streets of the city to the uniform suburban neighborhoods where every house seemed like a carbon copy of the next. It was not his first time being the new kid, yet this move felt altogether different. His mother had taken a better job, and his uncle had advised him to view it as a fresh start. But fresh starts, it seemed, did not exist when you looked like him. The moment he set foot on the campus of Richmond High, he sensed it immediately. There was a sudden pause in the conversation as he walked by. He noticed how some students glanced at him and then quickly averted their eyes, as though they hadn't realized they had just been staring. The teachers, for their part, appeared overly polite, their smiles a little too tight, their voices just a bit too careful. Dorian remained unmoved by these reactions. He had been in similar situations before, and for the first few periods of the day, nothing out of the ordinary happened. He settled into his seat, answered the teacher's questions when called upon, and concentrated on his work. Yet by the time lunch arrived, the feeling of being watched had begun to settle over him like an irritating itch beneath his skin. Tray in hand, he scanned the cafeteria for a place to sit. Most tables were already occupied by groups locked in lively conversations that clearly did not include him. A few students exchanged knowing looks and whispered amongst themselves. Eventually, Dorian spotted an empty seat near a guy who appeared too absorbed in scrolling through his phone to care about the world around him. It wasn't the ideal situation, but it would suffice for the moment. Barely had Dorian set his tray down when a voice cut sharply through the ambient noise. "You lost?" The question came from a blonde guy with an easy, self-assured smirk, a smirk that seemed to betray far too much confidence. He leaned back in his chair, and a few of his friends at the table watched with evident amusement. Dorian exhaled slowly. "Don't tell me you needed a map," the guy chuckled, shaking his head as if to emphasize that there were not many new faces around these parts. In the pause between his words, Dorian could sense an unspoken addendum in the tone, a suggestion that his presence was an anomaly, a deviation from the norm. Meeting the guy's gaze with an expression that was deliberately unreadable, Dorian thought silently, "Guess I'm the exception." The blonde smirk widened, and for a moment there appeared to be something more behind his amusement. Perhaps interest, or something else entirely. "Welcome to Ridgemont, man," he said. Dorian said nothing in response. He simply sat back down and picked up his fork. The unspoken message was clear. This was just the beginning. What had started as a few furtive looks and whispered remarks was soon to escalate into something far worse. At first it was only minor things, little side comments in the hallways, barely audible whispers that nonetheless reached Dorian's ears. "They don't know they let guys like him in here," someone murmured. "Wonder how long he'll last." Dorian had heard these things before, and he chose to ignore them. He was not at Richmond High to entertain their ignorance. However, there was one among them who would not let things slide. Bryce Tanner. Bryce had that kind of self-assured confidence that came from the knowledge that no one would ever dare to question him. His father owned half the car dealerships in town, and his crew followed him as if he were some kind of royalty. The quarterback, the student body golden boy, the guy who always got away with anything. For reasons Dorian could only guess at, Bryce had decided that Dorian's presence at Ridgemont was a problem. The first real test of Dorian's resolve came at his locker. He was in the process of swapping out his books when a sudden sharp bump sent him staggering forward. His shoulder slammed against the metal of the locker and the sound echoed down the hallway. "Oops," Bryce said with a tone of fake innocence, as though he hadn't seen Dorian there at all. Dorian did not react. He finished gathering his notebook and shut his locker with deliberate, controlled movements. He had learned long ago that if he gave his tormentors any reaction, they would only be encouraged to continue. Bryce's amusement was evident as he laughed. "You're quiet, huh? That's cool, really cool." Dorian turned to look at him. Not with anger, not with fear, but simply to gauge the other boy's intent. For just a moment, Bryce's smirk flickered, and then one of his friends, Nick, or maybe Kyle, their names blurred together in Dorian's mind, muttered something under his breath. Bryce grinned once more and added, "Catch you later, new guy." As they walked away, the usual hallway noise resumed. That was the first incident. The second incident took place in the cafeteria. Dorian was on his way toward the trash cans when suddenly a foot shot out in front of him. It was neither subtle nor covert. It was a blatant move intended to unsettle him. His body jolted forward, but he managed to steady himself before he could fall. "Relax, man, it was just a joke," Bryce said, raising his hands as if to placate him. Dorian, however, did not speak or even look in Bryce's direction. He simply stepped over the offending foot and continued on his path. More laughter erupted from someone nearby. "Too easy," someone muttered. Dorian clenched his jaw, and in that moment the words of his uncle echoed in his mind. "A lion doesn't flinch when the hyenas bark." He exhaled slowly, trying to let it go. But that was not enough for them. The third time Bryce interfered, he made it clear that this was no longer a matter of crude jokes. Later that day, after school had let out, Dorian had just finished a quiet session in the library. Most of the other students had already left and the parking lot was half empty. With no particular urgency, his mother would not be home from work for a few more hours. Dorian took his time as he stepped outside. That was when he heard voices that sounded all too familiar. "Hey, new guy!" Before Dorian could fully react, something struck him hard in the back. He staggered forward, catching himself before he fell to the pavement, while laughter echoed around him. Slowly turning, he saw Bryce standing there, flanked by Nick, Kyle, and a couple of other boys whose names did not matter. Bryce was still holding his drink cup, the last few drops clinging to his fingers. "Damn, my bad," Bryce said, his tone devoid of any genuine remorse. "Didn't see you there." Dorian glanced down, noting that his hoodie was splattered with soda, and he saw ice cubes scattered at his feet. For a moment, a heavy silence settled between them as other students lingering in the lot paused to watch. Dorian inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Bryce, with a smirk, prodded, "Come on, man, say something." Dorian did not speak. He simply began to walk past Bryce. That was when Bryce's behavior escalated. Without warning, Bryce shoved Dorian. It was not playful, it was forceful, clearly meant to provoke a reaction. Dorian stumbled back one step, his breathing remaining calm as he flexed his fingers at his sides. Bryce laughed derisively. "What, you scared?" Nick stepped forward, grinning. "Nah, man, he's just soft." For years, Dorian had heard that he should simply walk away. In that moment, he could almost hear his uncle's voice whispering, "Keep your hands in your pockets. Don't give them what they want." But right now, Bryce was not interested in an easy laugh. He was not merely playing around. He was determined to draw a reaction, to prove something. Taking one final deep breath, Dorian set his backpack down firmly. Bryce raised an eyebrow and remarked, "Oh, you got something to say now?" Dorian did not answer verbally. Instead, he rolled his shoulders back in a controlled manner. Bryce chuckled. "Man, that's as far as you got." And then, in a swift, almost imperceptible movement, Dorian took one quick step, first to the left in a feint to make Bryce react, and then a rapid, clean step to the right that ended with a sharp, stinging hook to Bryce's ribs. The sound of the impact was sickening. Bryce's breath hitched in a choked gasp as his body folded in reaction, yet Dorian was not finished. With a pivot and a perfectly executed uppercut, he sent Bryce's head snapping backward. Before Bryce could even consider steadying himself, his legs gave out entirely and he collapsed heavily onto the pavement. For a long, suspended moment, the world seemed to fall silent. Nick and the others stood frozen, mouths agape as Dorian stepped back, adjusting his hoodie with measured calm. His breathing was steady, his focus undisturbed. Bryce groaned as he rolled onto his side, and finally Dorian spoke. "You done?" Bryce offered no reply. He could only cough weakly in response. Dorian scanned the faces of the onlookers. Was anyone else going to stand up? No one moved. With that, he grabbed his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and walked away without a further word. Yet, even as he departed, it was clear that what had transpired in the parking lot was far from over. In truth, it was only the beginning. By the next morning, the entire school was abuzz with news. Dorian had made a statement without even checking his phone. The way people looked at him now said everything. The stairs, once merely a means of transition, were no longer met with idle curiosity. Instead, they now carried a new weight. Some students appeared visibly impressed, others looked nervously at him, and a few seemed to regard him as if they were seeing him for the first time. Bryce was noticeably absent from school that day, a detail that did not surprise Dorian, since taking a hit like that in front of half the parking lot was not something one bounced back from overnight. Even Nick and Kyle, who had once surrounded him with jeers, now kept their distance. Dorian entered class as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He sat down, pulled out his notebook and resumed his work in a manner that was as businesslike as ever. Yet the whispers persisted. As he moved through the cafeteria at lunchtime, conversations gradually quieted in his presence. Some students whispered, some nodded in acknowledgement, as if they had suddenly developed a newfound respect for him. Even the freshmen, those who had not spoken to him before, acted as though he had become something of a legend overnight. And then, as he passed by, murmurs circulated, "Damn, didn't know the new guy had hands." Another voice added, "He had it coming." Yet still another remarked, "He won't be back for a week." Dorian chose to ignore these comments. He was not there to be a hero or to seek validation. He was simply trying to navigate a world that already seemed to have decided his fate. Then, as he sat down, he caught yet another snippet of conversation. "He's just another violent thug," someone said in a tone that was soft but carried enough weight to reach him. Dorian turned his head slightly. A couple of girls at a nearby table had been watching him, one a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry and an expression that suggested she sensed something was amiss, quickly looked away when she realized that he had heard her. His stomach clenched. That was the curse of such moments. No matter how justified you might be or how right your actions seemed in the moment, there was always someone ready to twist the narrative. Dorian did not regret what had happened. Bryce had gone looking for a fight, and Dorian had simply ensured that he got one. Yet the weight of the encounter settled heavily upon him. For years he had trained to control his impulses. For years he had practiced the art of walking away. That discipline had never been a sign of weakness. It was a mark of strength. And still, he could not shake the feeling that no matter what choice he made in that moment, people would always see him through a predetermined lens. Dorian was about to learn that real strength was not solely about throwing a punch. It was about what came next, about how one chose to define oneself in the wake of conflict. As the rest of the week unfolded, everything seemed to pass in a blur. Bryce did not show up, and his friends no longer bothered Dorian as they once had. The intensity of the whispers and the sharp stares began to fade. The steps on the stairs lost some of their earlier weight. Yet, despite the apparent calm, something intangible still hung in the air. A lingering tension that Dorian could feel deep within himself. One afternoon, as he was leaving the gym after practice, Coach Harrison called him over. "Got a minute?" the coach asked. Dorian hesitated. He was not in the mood for another lecture, but something in the coach's tone compelled him to stop. They walked outside, moving toward the track where the football team was finishing practice. "I heard what happened," Coach Harrison said quietly once they were alone. "Figured you had your reasons." Dorian nodded, though he was not about to offer an apology. The coach studied him for a moment before continuing. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Dorian simply shrugged. "I've been boxing since I was a kid," he replied. The coach let out a low whistle. "Yeah, that much is obvious. You're good. But let me ask you something. Did that fight change anything?" Dorian looked at him uncertainly, unsure of where the conversation was headed. The coach crossed his arms and pressed further. "You think Bryce learned something, or that the rest of them did?" Dorian exhaled slowly, running a hand over his head as he silently acknowledged that he already knew the answer. Bryce, after all, was not the kind of guy who ever took a moment to reflect. And as for the others, some now respected him, some feared him, and some would always view him the way they wanted, regardless of his actions. Coach Harrison nodded, as if he could see the swirl of thoughts running through Dorian's head. "The thing is, people like Bryce, they don't really lose. Not in a way that lasts. He'll come back, he'll run his mouth, and the cycle will start all over again. But you're different. You have control." Dorian frowned, uncertain of the implication. "What are you saying?" he asked. The coach tilted his head toward the field. where the wrestling coach was gathering a few of the kids. "I've been telling the boxing coach to send me a few kids for wrestling. Have you ever thought about putting all that skill to better use?" Dorian blinked in surprise. The wrestling coach grinned broadly. "Look, I know you can handle yourself, that much is obvious. But there's a difference between winning a fight and learning how to own your power." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've seen too many kids like you get boxed into a reputation they never wanted. You've already proven you're not someone to be messed with. Now prove that there's more to you than just that." For a long moment Dorian said nothing. In that silence, the weight of his past and the promise of his future collided. Fighting had always been about survival, about standing your ground when the world pushed you aside. But now, the coach's words hinted at something more, the possibility of transcending the cycle and redefining what it meant to be strong. That night, Dorian sat on his bed with his uncle's old boxing gloves in his hands. The room was dimly lit, and the soft hum of the night outside provided a backdrop to his thoughts. He reflected on all the times he had held back, all the moments when he had chosen to walk away. And then he remembered the one time he had not walked away. The one time when he had let his guard down and a fight had erupted in the parking lot. The coach had been right. Bryce would never truly change, and people would always be quick to judge based on a single incident. But Dorian still had a choice. Perhaps just this time, he could choose to do something different. Real strength, he now realized, was not just about knowing when to fight. It was about understanding what was worth fighting for, about taking control of one's own destiny, and about defining oneself on one's own terms. The next morning, as the news of the previous day's event spread like wildfire through the halls of Richmond High, Dorian felt an odd mix of emotions. He was not seeking glory or validation. He only wanted to be recognized as a person with depth, a person who was more than just the sum of his past encounters. The whispers and stares had transformed from expressions of judgment into something more complex, a mixture of respect, awe, and even a hint of fear. As he made his way through the corridors, he observed the subtle changes in the atmosphere. The stairs, which once had been a mere transition between classes, now carried a weight that seemed to acknowledge his presence. Some students looked at him with admiration, others with trepidation, and still others with a curiosity that was both new and unwelcome. It was as if, overnight, Dorian had been recast in a role he had never auditioned for, a role that demanded not just physical strength, but an inner resolve that transcended mere brawn. By lunchtime, the cafeteria had taken on a different air. Groups that once seemed impenetrable in their closed conversations now shifted their dynamics whenever Dorian passed by. Some whispered his name, while others nodded in silent acknowledgement. A few freshmen, who had once been intimidated by his quiet presence, now looked up to him as though he were a living legend. And amidst all of this, there were voices that still persisted, voices that could not be silenced by even the most dramatic of gestures. "Damn," one student murmured. "Didn't know the new kid had hands." Another added with a note of finality, "Bryce had it coming." And yet another voice, softer still but equally persistent, remarked, "He won't be back for a week." Dorian chose to ignore these comments. He was not interested in becoming a hero or a martyr. He was simply determined to be true to himself, to be the person he had always wanted to be, regardless of what anyone else might think. As the day wore on, Dorian's internal dialogue continued to echo the lessons of the past. His uncle's advice, the coach's insights, and even the murmurs of the students all merged into a single coherent truth. Real strength was not measured solely by the force of one's fists, but by the choices one made in the aftermath of conflict. It was about knowing when to stand up and when to walk away, about understanding that every action carried a weight that could tip the balance between respect and ridicule. That afternoon, after classes had ended and the school was once again filled with the low hum of conversations and the shuffle of students leaving for home, Dorian found himself alone on the empty track by the school building. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the field. He sat down on a worn bench, the cool metal a welcome contrast to the lingering heat of the day. Here, in the quiet solitude, he allowed himself to reflect on the tumultuous events of the past few days. Every slight, every push, every mocking laugh. The memories were all there, vivid and unyielding, Yet in their wake there was also something new, the realization that every challenge presented an opportunity to redefine oneself. The echoes of Bryce's laughter, the jeers of his classmates, and even the disappointed sighs of teachers, all of it had coalesced into a singular lesson for Dorian. He understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that he was being forced to confront not just his own limitations, but also the narrow perceptions that others held of him. For so long he had tried to fit into a world that seemed intent on labeling him by his appearance and his past. Now, however, he was beginning to see that he held the power to rewrite that narrative. His strength lay not in the blows he delivered, but in the choices he made afterward, in the quiet determination to rise above the pettiness of his detractors and to define himself on his own terms. It was in that moment of introspection that Dorian made a silent vow to himself. A vow that regardless of the path that lay ahead, he would never allow anyone else to dictate who he was. His journey was far from over, and he understood that the scars of yesterday might never fully fade. But he also recognized that these scars were not signs of weakness. They were badges of honor, proof that he had survived every challenge thrown his way. And while the world might always try to cast him in a role defined by past conflicts and preconceived notions, Dorian resolved that he would forge a new identity, one that celebrated not just his physical strength, but his inner resilience and unwavering integrity. In the days that followed, as the routine of school life resumed, Dorian began to notice subtle shifts in the attitudes of those around him. The once dismissive glances became tinged with reluctant admiration. The whispered comments, though still present, began to take on a note of cautious respect. Even the teachers, whose overly careful smiles had once made him feel like an outsider, now regarded him with a quiet acknowledgement of his strength. It was as if, in the wake of that fateful confrontation, the entire school had been forced to reconsider the assumptions they had made about him. Yet for all the external changes, the internal struggle remained. Every time he passed a familiar hallway or sat in a classroom filled with memories of past hardships, Dorian was reminded that his journey towards self-acceptance was far from complete. The lessons he had learned that day, the importance of measured action, the power of restraint, and the understanding that true strength came from within, would have to be revisited again and again. In his head, he thought of himself engaging the struggle again, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew that each step he took would be a testament to his evolving identity. In quiet moments between classes, Dorian would find himself replaying the events of that turbulent week in his mind. He remembered Bryce's sneering face, the mocking laughter that had once filled the hallways, and even the hushed conversations that had trailed him like shadows. But with each recollection came a deeper understanding. He realized that every harsh word and every act of aggression had, in its own way, served as a catalyst for growth. They had pushed him to confront not just the external world, but also the inner doubts and fears that he had long tried to suppress. One afternoon, as he walked home along a tree-lined street, the golden hues of the setting sun painted everything in a soft, forgiving light. In that gentle glow, Dorian felt a sense of calm wash over him. He recalled the coach's words that had initially seemed like mere instructions, but now resonated with profound meaning. There was a difference between winning a fight and owning one's power, between reacting impulsively and choosing a path that reflected true inner strength. And so, with each step he took, Dorian embraced that philosophy a little more fully, understanding that his actions in the coming days and weeks would ultimately define not only how others saw him, but, more importantly, how he saw himself. By the time Dorian reached his doorstep, the sky had deepened into twilight, and the first stars were beginning to shimmer overhead. He paused for a moment on the porch, taking a deep breath as he prepared himself for whatever challenges lay ahead. He knew that the scars of the past might never fully disappear, but he also knew that he possessed the strength to rise above them. In that quiet moment, beneath a vast, starlit sky, he made a promise to himself, that no matter how many times the world tried to box him in or define him by a single moment of conflict, he would always remain true to who he was. His identity, forged through years of struggle, was not something that could be easily rewritten by the opinions of others. It was his alone, and he would continue to shape it with every decision he made. As the weeks turned into months, the events at Richmond High became part of the school's lore, A whispered legend passed along in the hallways and echoed in the quiet corners of the cafeteria. New students came and went, each with their own stories of trials and triumphs, but the memory of that transformative encounter with Bryce lingered. Some students, inspired by Dorian's quiet defiance, began to question the old hierarchies that had long governed their interactions. Others, still wary of change, clung to the familiar labels and roles. And yet, through it all, Dorian remained a steadfast presence, a living reminder that strength was not merely a physical attribute, but a quality that emerged from within in the face of adversity. In quiet conversations with his teachers and the few friends he had managed to make, Dorian shared his reflections on what had transpired. He talked about the complexity of human nature, the way that people could be simultaneously cruel and kind, judgmental yet capable of growth. He acknowledged that his own journey was only beginning, and that every day would present a new challenge, a new opportunity to reaffirm the values he held dear. And though he never sought praise or recognition for the choices he made, those who truly listened could sense the quiet resolve in his words, the conviction that real strength was about more than fighting. It was about rising, again and again, no matter how many times one was knocked down. There were times, especially during the long, quiet hours of early morning before school, when Dorian would find himself alone with his thoughts. In those moments, the memories of bullying and isolation mingled with the lessons learned on that fateful day. The pain of being different, the feeling of always being on the outside looking in, remained with him. Yet so did the understanding that those very differences were what made him unique, what endowed him with a perspective that was all his own. In embracing that truth, he slowly began to build a future that was not defined by the limitations of others' expectations, but by the limitless possibilities of his own determination. In the end, Dorian's journey was not simply about surviving a single confrontation or weathering a week of whispered judgments. It was about the gradual, often painful process of self-discovery, a process that demanded courage, perseverance, and above all, an unwavering belief in one's own worth. With every passing day, he learned that strength was not measured in blows exchanged or battles won, but in the quiet moments of reflection, in the choices made when no one was watching, and in the relentless pursuit of a life defined by authenticity and integrity. Standing now at the threshold of a new chapter, Dorian understood that his story was far from over. Each step he took was a declaration of his independence from the past, a commitment to forge a future that would be uniquely his own. And though the echoes of yesterday's struggles might forever linger in the background, he was determined to let them serve as reminders of what he had overcome, rather than as shackles to his potential. In every classroom, every conversation, and every silent glance exchanged in the corridors of Richmond High, he carried with him the quiet conviction that his identity was his to shape. And with that conviction came a newfound freedom. The freedom to define his own strength, to choose his own battles, and ultimately, to become the person he was always meant to be.